Good morning, friends and brethren. So good to see you. It's good to see a nice number here today. Glad that you're here and glad we have others that are tuning in online too. We welcome you as well. So I've had this lesson kind of churning around in my mind since the first of the month when our children, the smaller classes, they studied about the two calves. The golden calves that were built and placed in Dan and Bethel. And I've thought many times about the multitude of stories and lessons that can be found from that text. And so primarily today we're going to be looking at 1 Kings chapter 11 and 12. And so you might want to go there. We'll be spending some time there today. Then we'll take a diversion or two along the way. So in the text, Jeroboam was to become king over Israel. And he knew that because he was told that by the prophet Ahijah. And as often the case, there's a backstory. There is more to the story that we need to understand. Events that led up to this point in time. So actually we go back in the storyline back to the reign of King Solomon. Solomon, the son of David. Solomon was a man of great wisdom given to him by God because he requested that of God. He became a man of great wealth and did and accomplished many wonderful things. But also we have to recognize that later in his life, Solomon was a man who disobeyed God. Solomon had a problem with foreign gods. Really, it was a problem with his foreign wives that started that. And in time, he did some things to help them worship their gods. And so that's kind of the issue. That's what kind of starts the direction of some things that this story goes. Solomon had done what God commanded not to do, marry foreign wives. The Lord said specifically, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 2. But it was even before then, God already had a disposition on this matter. If we go back to the book of Deuteronomy, here's what he had to say in Deuteronomy chapter 7. And let's see, we'll begin around verse 3. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 3. And it says here, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. So you see, the backstory takes us all the way back here, where God already had a disposition on this. To his people, the children of Israel, don't marry foreign wives, because the concern would be is you'll be pulled away by them and their gods and choose to serve them. You know, when we come to King Solomon, I would have just thought he would have done better than that. Because Solomon was a man of great wisdom, a man, as we said already, who had obeyed God. God had blessed him. But even Solomon was influenced and drawn away to serve other gods. And so this idea of saying, it can't happen to me, where sometimes we're faced with issues in life, and sometimes we draw close to those who are living in sin. And sometimes we say, I know we do, because I've heard people say it, that won't happen to me. If anyone was in a position to be wise enough to say, it won't happen to me, it was Solomon. And Solomon was drawn away by the influences around him. We look at our text now. In 1 Kings chapter 11. We're going to be reading several verses there today. I hope you'll follow. 1 Kings chapter 11, we begin reading at verse 4. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart from after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed the Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On the hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Solomon, as he got old, had a heart problem. No, not that kind. But he had a heart problem with regard to his love and his devotion to Jehovah God. And I'm not sure that I could see this coming. Because when you read about the life of Solomon and his desire to serve God, the fact that God chose Solomon to be the one to build his temple in Jerusalem, and that he wished for wisdom, he asked God for wisdom, and God gave him wisdom, and he made so many good choices, I wouldn't have seen this coming. But just as God said so much before time, don't marry foreign wives because you'll be pulled away to serve their gods. God was right. And that's exactly what happened, even with Solomon. And so Solomon demonstrated that he was not fully devoted to God, and he did evil in the sight of God. And though he did some things that was right, the text would tell us, he did not follow God completely. Yeah, God really expects that we will follow him completely. And instead, he built idols. I'm not sure what more you can say, but he built idols in high places where these could be worshipped. And Solomon not only disobeyed Jehovah God, but he boldly turned his back on God. It's hard for me to imagine this and to think about this, that the fact that on the east side of Jerusalem, I'm taking it like on the other side of the Garden of Gethsemane, we would come to know later, and the Mount of Olives, on that high side, on the east side of Jerusalem, it was there that Solomon built these high places to worship gods. All within sight of the temple that Solomon had built for Jehovah God. It's not far away that here he built a place for these gods. The Lord became very angry with Solomon because of this disobedience. We keep reading. Chapter 11, verse 9. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. And although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Here are the consequences. We know the sin. We understand where Solomon once was. We understand where he is now. We understand the sin. And now we see the consequences to that, because there will always be consequences to sin. I mean, we think back to other great men like Moses, this great leader of God who struck the rock when he was supposed to speak to it and who did not give glory to God for bringing water to the children of Israel. Moses paid a price for that. And do you remember, King Saul, the first king of Israel, who was a man who was humble of heart, who God had picked and chosen to lead his people, who in time his heart moved away from God and he disobeyed God, did not kill the Amalekites like God had commanded him to do. There were consequences because of that. There always is. Now God is saying the kingdom would be taken away. It will be taken away from his son, not from Solomon, but from his son Rehoboam, and given to Jeroboam, someone who was not even a part of his family. And it was because of Solomon's disobedience. There are always far-reaching consequences for sin, but that's not the end. I mean, the story goes on. The far-reaching consequences, there's much more. Little known to Israel at this time is just how far the effects of Solomon's sin will carry them. No doubt, the influence of Solomon building the high places for the gods of his wives was running its course. Because if Solomon was the one who built these high places, surely there are people who would have said, well, it's not only Jehovah God that we should worship here in the temple, but we can go to the temples of the gods of his wives. The king approves of these things. And we see how far that would go. I mean, what would you expect but that some would accept and follow the direction of the king, even though it was leading in a direction away from Jehovah God? And again, it just amazes me to think of these shrines and temples being built even within sight of God's temple in Jerusalem. So where does all this lead? Well, we introduced Jeroboam to the story. Jeroboam was not part of the family, but he was a subordinate of Solomon. He was an administrator in Solomon's kingdom. He was the one who was in charge of the labor force. He was one who had some influence, for sure, among men, and he was a trusted leader of Solomon. And then something significant happened. Some would say a coincidence that he met the prophet Ahijah. Oh, I don't think so. I don't think it's a coincidence. It's not by chance. 1 Kings 11, verse 29. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah the prophet of Shiloh met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, see, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David in the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe." Here's the prophecy. Here he's being told what's going to happen. Ahijah spoke to Jeroboam and said, this is the way it is. This is what God says. This is the will of Jehovah God. Jeroboam will have 10 tribes. Solomon's son Rehoboam will have 2. Benjamin folds into Judah. And so now are we understanding why this is happening? Disobedience. Started with Solomon's disobedience, marrying those foreign wives who influenced him with their foreign gods, and Israel is being divided on the matter and on the issue. Soon, Jeroboam is going to become king over Israel, the tribes to the north. You will be king over Israel, God says, if. Verse 37. However, as for you, I will take you and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You'll be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command, and you walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes, keeping my statutes and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. There's the promise. It's an incredible promise. I mean, he is giving the kingdom to Jeroboam. There is this caveat that is nothing new. It's what God has said to his people all along. If you obey me, if you obey my commands, if you do hear what I have told you to do, this is the word. Solomon heard about it. When you read through chapter 11 and 12, Solomon heard about it, and as we could guess, he was not happy about this at all. In fact, he tried to kill Jeroboam, and so Jeroboam had to flee to Egypt, and he stayed there until Solomon died. But you know, Solomon's actions trying to kill the one to whom God has given the kingdom, Solomon's actions are not going to change anything. God has already decreed, here is what's going to happen. But death came to Solomon, as it does to all men. Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him, but because he sought and accepted bad advice, the people rebelled against Rehoboam. Well, there's a whole other story there. You know, Rehoboam's poor choices and leadership decisions cost him to lose most of the kingdom, just as God said would happen. But at this time, Jeroboam came back from Egypt and became a spokesman for the people before King Rehoboam. The people were wishing that they were not to be taxed so heavy. You know the story. And Rehoboam consulted advisors that were older and wiser men who said, ease the burden on the people, they'll serve you forever. Then he went to some other advisors, the younger men who are his friends, and they said, no, tax them more heavily. And he accepted that advice. And sure enough, Israel rejected Rehoboam. And they sought out Jeroboam and made him king over Israel. Only Judah followed the house of David. Rehoboam, the king of 2 tribes. Just as the prophet Ahijah predicted, Jeroboam became the king of 10 tribes. In the big picture, God prevailed once again. It looked as though all was going well for Jeroboam, because now here he is leading the bigger of the divided kingdom, 10 tribes. He was chosen by God to lead the larger part of Israel. God had promised it to bless him. I will be with you. And you think about how Jehovah God was on his side. And here's what we just got to stop and think about this for a moment. How we got to this point. The events that have taken place, what has happened to the kingdom as it's divided as God said it would happen, because going back to Solomon's sins. And so now Jeroboam is leading the larger tribe, the 10 tribes in the north. God has promised to bless him. We know what that means. We've seen God's promise to bless his people in the past and how he comes through with that, how he cares for and blesses and the people prosper, and how the kings become even more powerful when they're obedient to God. Here was the promise from God. Here is what was in Jeroboam's hands. Remember there was that if you obey my commands and my statutes, if you walk in my ways. But all is not well in Israel, because all is not well with the heart of Jeroboam. Jeroboam came to the throne because Rehoboam listened to the wrong counsel regarding taxes. But in the bigger picture is because God had rejected Solomon. That's the bigger story. That's what started all of this. The prophet Ahijah predicted Jeroboam would become king. He has, just as the prophet predicted. And he told Jeroboam again the criteria for being the king that God would bless over all of Israel. And that was to heed all that God commanded. Chapter 11, verse 38 again. If you do whatever I command and you walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commands as David, my servant, did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. Walk in my way is what God said. Jeroboam had a short memory, and soon he did not remember. Or maybe he just didn't care what God had told him or what God required, because Jeroboam made a foolish choice by listening to the counsel of men rather than following the instructions of God. I think it's a very key point right here. You know, that this is part of what David read to us a few moments ago in chapter 12, verse 26 beginning. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. And he said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel and the other in Dan, and this thing became a sin. The people went even as far as Dan to worship the one there. We see in what's happening now. He sought the advice of men. Somehow when David was reading that a few moments ago, that part just kind of stood out to me when he said it. He sought the advice of men. Here was the problem. Here was this a great problem for Jeroboam. Instead of listening to and relying on what God had said and the instructions that had come from him, he is seeking the advice of men that is never going to turn out well. And it certainly did not for Jeroboam or for the children of Israel. What was he thinking? Just what was he thinking? Has he already forgot the reason God took the kingdom away from Solomon? It was sin. It was disobedience. It was a heart problem of Solomon. And here Jeroboam is doing the same thing after seeking the counsel of men. So Jeroboam did as he desired, and he set up gods to appeal to the people. I mean, ultimately, that's what it was. He was trying to appeal to the people out of fear of the people becoming discontent with him and perhaps losing the kingdom. He appealed to their human reasoning. No, it's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. As though the good king is trying to say to them, I'm trying to help you in this. I know that you need to worship, but Jerusalem is just so far away. Let me help you with this. That's too far to go. But no, Jeroboam knew the significance of Jerusalem through the years and the temple there that represented the very presence of God. And he was afraid that if the people went there, they would be reminded of the diligence that they should have serving Jehovah God. That's what he was concerned about. For your convenience is what he's saying. This is easier for you. And if we can just think about this for a moment. When he is saying to them, I'm doing this for you. It's just too much to go up to Jerusalem. This is easier. For your convenience, here's a way that you can worship. This is what will work well. And we are reminded time and again through the Bible story, and even today in our lives, we are reminded that sometimes it's so easy just to do what others do. It is so easy just to accept what others say, to worship as others do, to disregard the commands of God in view of doing things the way that man chooses. Sometimes that's easy to do, but it never works well. Never does that turn out for good. What we often fail to see is that when we come up with our own ideas and our own methods of worshiping God, it's nothing more than our turning our backs to him. That's what Solomon did. Solomon turned his back on God. And now Jeroboam and the children of Israel are doing the same thing. They are turning their backs on God. And when we choose to write our own means and methods of worshiping, when we make our own creeds, when we make our own gospel, so to speak, to follow, and we excuse the ideas of men who promote new ideas, and we just accept those, and we accept new ways of worship, but we ignore what God says about how he wants to be worshiped, the end result will be no different than Solomon. No different than Jeroboam and those who follow him. Jehovah God expects that we should walk in his ways. Even as he said to Jeroboam so long ago, there are so many lessons to be drawn from this story. Visiting the ancient city of Dan a few years ago, there were some interesting insights. So you try to think and you try to picture. When you think about stories like this, you try to imagine the people, at least I do. I need a picture in my mind. You know, maybe it's a weak mind, it's been said before, but I do need a picture in my mind. And I try to imagine these people in the places, the high places, where would that be? I can see Jerusalem. I can see, I can see the hill on the east side of the city, and I can imagine the shrines there. I got that in my mind. But in Dan, what was that like? What did that look like? Because there were 2 golden calves that were offered. You know, there was Bethel that was not so far from Jerusalem toward the south. There was Dan far to the north. And there is a city of Dan that you can visit today, the excavated city, the ancient city that's there. And it is a very old city, taking us back even to the days of Abraham. Remember, he went there after the battles with regard to getting Lot and his people back. that he entered the city of Dan. And in fact, you can see even they've dug out the ancient entrance to the city. But during the days of Jeroboam, that was not being used. But there was another entrance to the city. And you can walk through some of those stone streets and you can see the walls of the city. Oh, I know they're not as high as they were in that day, I'm sure. But you can see the walls around the city and the gates there. And you would walk through the gate into a courtyard. And even there in the courtyard, you would find some things familiar to biblical text, because there in the courtyard by the gate, you can see where there was a seat. Remember how often the kings or the judges sat at the gate of the city and greeted people or made judgments as people came. And you can go through that very gate today and walk the street, part of the streets at least of the old city. The gates of the city that the king is sitting at the gate and the people came before the king. We are reminded about with David when he sat at the gate, not of this city, but of another city. And that of Jehoshaphat in another time. And you go through the gate and into the city, and you can see where there were 3 gates there, not uncommon to that period of time. It's for defenses, and it was also a place there where merchants would set up for trade. The city of Dan was a busy city. It was a fortified city. It was on the northern boundaries of the kingdom. And we can imagine that there was not only a number of people living there, but there was a strong military presence too, because it was this being that border town. But as you walk through the streets of the city, and you have to walk a pretty good little ways to the far side of the city, you walk along a stream that's one of the tributaries that begins the Jordan River, comes from the spring of Dan right there. And you walk a little farther to the far side of the city, and there is there a high place. And it's noticeable as you're walking out of the city. This would have been outside the city walls, I would take it. And as you walk out of that and you walk up a small rise to a high place, which from there you can see beyond. And you come to that point, and it becomes rather obvious what happens here. There has been uncovered, in fact, a place where an altar would have been. The fabrication you see on top, of course, is something that's been put there just for appearance. But you can see where the altar would have been, where sacrifices would have been offered. But if you look beyond that, you see stairs back in the back, steps going up on a higher plane. And it is there you'd walk up on those steps where, undoubtedly, in the days of Jeroboam, there was a golden calf. And that's where they went. When Jeroboam was telling the people of Israel, it's just too far for you to go to Jerusalem and set up golden calves in Bethel and in Dan. Here's one of the places the children of Israel went to worship their gods. Right here. But one of the things that was just so interesting to me was the steps. They're just on one side of the platform, not on the other, because people would come and they'd walk up this side of the steps. And it was just standing there looking at these steps that some things occurred to me. You remember when Daniel was taken captivity into Babylon? And yet he still remembered Jehovah God, and 3 times a day he would go and open his windows and he would look toward Jerusalem and he would pray to God. Because there was importance, there was significance to that ancient city, even as it had represented the presence of God. And he would look toward Jerusalem. Jeroboam, remember, did not want the people to go to Jerusalem for fear that they would forget about him and remember Jehovah God. And so when they would come to this place, to this platform, and they would climb these steps and they would bow before their God, which way were they facing? Well, that's to the north. Jerusalem's to the south. Behind their backs. And in such a very literal way, they were turning their backs on God. And we think about Solomon, how he turned his back on God by allowing the worship of these foreign gods and building shrines for them, and how Jeroboam, having been promised the kingdom and blessings from God if he would obey him, turned his back on God and built these calves. And now it's Israel. It's all of Israel who are going to these golden calves and bowing down and turning their backs on God. It's a very vivid picture in my mind of what they were doing. And the application then becomes very strong for us. You know, the idea of convenience. It's too much for you to go to Jerusalem. You know, the idea of worshiping like others, like all the nations around, like all of our friends around us, they worship these gods. Now we can worship them too. The idea of worshiping in whatever manner we choose. All of these are ideas that become very real and very prevalent. And all of these ideas have long affected the way people would try, even how God's people would try to worship him. Even today. Is it too much for us to do the will of God? That's all he was asking. In every instruction that God has ever given to man with regard to worship to him and following him, it's always been with that in mind, just to follow me, do as I say, worship me. Is it too much to worship God, the creator of all? Is it too much for us to do that? Will we ever be satisfied to just listen to the commands of God, accept them, and obey them as he has said for us to do? God's promise to Jeroboam of old was that you shall reign over all your heart's desires. He was blessing him with all the kingdom, with prosperity, if you heed what I command and do what's right in my eyes. Let's understand the significance of Jeroboam's leadership. It bears the mark of leading Israel farther away from God. That's what he did. Jeroboam basically said, you know, it doesn't really matter how you worship God. One way of worship is just as good as another. Basically, that's what Jeroboam was saying. You know, Jeroboam was saying, you know, God's law really is not that important. You know, it's no consequence whether or not we obey all that he says or not. Especially if it's inconvenient. We don't have to do everything that God says. That's what he was saying. Jeroboam basically made a mockery of God's law. And Israel fell for it. And Israel never again turned to God. There's such a very powerful ecumenical movement around us today that basically says, you know, it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you love God. It doesn't matter what church you go to. You know, as long as you pray to God and you call on his name, you know, that's what people say around us. It's interesting how strong that movement has become in the last 30 or 40 years, because even 30 or 40 years ago, the denominations would debate among themselves about doctrine. And for the most part, they don't even care to do that anymore. It doesn't matter what you believe as long as you love God. When have we ever found that to be the Bible pattern? When? Never. Always God has called for those who would be his people to be accepting of his will, obey his words. Always. You know, even among churches of Christ, there have been divisions through the years. Divisions continue to come. And today we are grappling with issues among churches of Christ that are very important and significant. There are some churches of Christ today that are even getting so far away from God's word that they would not make any big pretense about the need of baptism for remission of sins to be a child of God. If you've called on the name of God, if you've had an experience in your heart, there are churches not so far away from us that would be proposing those ideas. The idea of instrumental music in worship. You know, the Lord's church has become the anomaly with regard to not using instruments of music in worship because there's no biblical pattern for that. Not in New Testament worship. And yet, churches of Christ, many are struggling on that issue today. Many are accepting that. The idea of roles, men's and women's roles in the church, so well defined in Scripture, leadership roles. And churches today, so-called churches of Christ, that are accepting and introducing women in leadership roles of teaching, the auditorium class, adult classes, or preaching, leading singing, and things as this. And it wasn't that many years ago where among our fellowship, there wouldn't have been debates on those things. But you see, once you come to a point, once there's the influence from the outside that says, it doesn't really matter how we worship. As long as you love God. Isn't that what Jeroboam was saying? It's just too inconvenient for you to go all the way to Jerusalem. I have a new way for you to worship. It's so much closer, so much easier. This will work just as well. Well, it didn't work just as well. Israel moved farther away from God and never returned. There are lessons that we can learn from these episodes of so long ago. And we need to let them not get far away from our mind. Because it does make a difference what we believe. It does make a difference how we respond to what God has to say. Jesus would tell us the same thing. And he would do it in no uncertain terms even. In Matthew chapter 7 and verse 21 is Jesus speaking when he says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And he will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name and cast out demons in your name and done many wonderful works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" You see, God's disposition on these things has never changed. There's nothing new under the sun. In particular, with regard to God's expectation of his creation, nothing new here. That he has always given man direction, a pattern on what to do and how to live and what he expects of us. And he has always demanded that we follow what he says. And the results of disobedience, it's never been different. We become separated from him. We lose the blessings that are found in him. We lose eternal hope. There's nothing new. Lessons of old, I think, are very important for us to consider, for us to remember, because we can make application today. Enough so that it causes us to have to stop and think and evaluate. Are we still following what God says? Are we doing just as he would want us to do? Can we still be called his people? Because that's what we want. We want to stand before him right and whole. And we can. He's provided the means. He's provided the ways. God's grace is great. And in his grace, he has given and sent his son.